she threw open the door to my cabin like she owned it. Didn't knock, didn't call ahead, just turned the handle and walked in like property rights were something that applied to other people. The timing could not have been worse for her, or better for me, depending on how you're keeping score. Because sitting at my kitchen table at that exact moment, coffee in hand, reviewing the documents I had spent 4 months assembling, was a woman named Patricia Webb, Assistant Attorney General for the state of Texas. 14 years prosecuting fraud. The kind of person who, when surprised by a stranger barging into a private residence, sets her coffee down with the particular deliberateness of someone deciding what category of problem they're looking at. Linda Prescott stood in my doorway in designer clothes and the expression of someone who has never once been told her presence was unwelcome. She looked at me. She looked at Patricia. She looked at the documents spread across my kitchen table, a number of which had her name on them. The color left her face the way water leaves a cracked bucket. Slow at first, then all at once. I said, "Linda, you just walked into a private residence without permission. You might want to think carefully about your next sentence." Patricia picked her coffee back up. "Tell me where you're watching from. Then stay with me, because what happened in the next 4 hours at Lakeview Pines Cabin Community would require a screenwriter to tone it down if it were fiction. And the 6 months leading up to it, the harassment, the property schemes. The fraud documented page by page in that kitchen table file is a story every property owner needs to hear. My name is Wade Thurston. I'm 58 years old, third-generation Texan, and the owner of a 12-acre lake property in Caldwell County that my grandfather purchased in 1951 for reasons that seemed simple at the time. He wanted a place where his family could fish in the mornings and watch thunderstorms roll in over the water at night without anyone telling them what to do. He built the cabin himself over 3 summers with help from 2 brothers and a cousin. The original structure is still the core of the building. You can see his handwriting in pencil on the interior framing where he marked measurements before cutting. Every wall he put up is still standing. I intend to keep it that way. My wife Carol teaches high school history. We have 1 daughter in college in Austin and a truck with 200,000 miles that I refuse to replace because it has never once let me down at an inconvenient moment. I mention this because it is relevant to the kind of person I am and the kind of person I am not. I am not a man who looks for conflict. I spent 3 decades managing commercial irrigation systems across Central Texas, which teaches you patience, precision, and the particular discipline of letting a problem show you its full shape before you respond to it. Linda Prescott moved to Lakeview Pines Cabin Community 2 years ago and was elected HOA president 7 months later, which is roughly the speed at which certain personalities can convince a neighborhood that enthusiasm is the same thing as competence. She came from real estate development in Austin, divorced, mid-50s, and operating with the specific energy of someone who had decided that a lake community in Caldwell County was going to be her reinvention project whether the community wanted that or not. She drove a white Range Rover. She wore the kind of footwear that communicated she did not spend a lot of time on unpaved surfaces. She referred to her vision for Lakeview Pines in language that community members described to me afterward as exhausting. The trouble announced itself the way these things usually do, not with a declaration, but with a pattern. The first time Linda drove her Range Rover across my property, I assumed it was a navigation error. The access easement for the community dock runs along the northern edge of my 12 acres, and there is a paved community road that follows it. Linda's vehicle was not on the community road. It was 50 feet inside my property line, cutting through a section of cedar and live oak that my grandfather had deliberately left natural because he liked the way it looked from the water. I walked to where she had stopped and introduced myself. She was on her phone. She acknowledged me with the gesture people use when they are pretending to be more occupied than they are and do not want the conversation happening. I waited. She finished her call, lowered her window, and told me in the friendly, aggressive tone of an HOA president in her first year of office that she was assessing the community's lakefront access points. She said it in the way people say things they know are half true, with just enough procedure language to sound official. I told her she was on private property. I told her the assessment, whatever its purpose, would need to happen on the community easement, not on my 12 acres. I was civil. I was direct. I showed her my deed on my phone screen and pointed to the property lines. She said, "I'll look into it." She looked into it the way people look into things when they already know the answer, and are hoping the problem will become complicated enough to work around. 3 weeks later, her Range Rover was on my property again. Different location. Same pattern. I filed a trespassing complaint with the county sheriff's office, documented the tire tracks with my phone camera, and called a property attorney in Lockhart named James Hollis, who had handled agricultural property disputes in this county for 22 years. James drove out, looked at the situation, reviewed my deed, and said something I have remembered since. "Wade," he said, "I've seen this exact situation 3 times. Always a new HOA president, always a real estate background, always starts with access and ends with something more ambitious." He paused. "Keep documenting, the pattern will show itself." James was right, and I did not have to wait long. The scheme revealed itself through a conversation I was not supposed to hear. I was working on the dock float mechanism one afternoon, the part of maintenance work that is quiet and requires concentration, and therefore places you close to the water in a way that people on shore do not register as a presence. Linda had brought 2 couples to the community dock for what I initially took to be a casual visit. It was not casual. She was describing my 12 acres as part of a lakefront development expansion. She used the phrase expanded access footprint. She talked about the view corridors from where she was standing toward my cabin, and the cedar stand and the shoreline that my grandfather had planted with native grasses in 1967. She said the words exclusive community ownership in a tone that presumed the thing she was describing already existed or was about to. She was selling my property as an amenity for houses that were not yet built to people who had not yet bought them. I stayed very still on the float until they left. Then I called James. He asked me if I had recorded it. I told him I had not. He said, "Document what you heard, date and time, and we'll start building the picture." This is what it always looks like from the outside right before you find out what's actually happening on paper. What was actually happening on paper took 2 weeks of courthouse research to fully understand. James pulled Linda's development company filings, her application materials for the HOA president position, and the marketing documents she had submitted to a regional real estate publication describing Lakeview Pines as a lakefront community with expanded private acreage and development-ready natural corridors. The documents described property she did not own. My property. In specific enough detail that James circled portions with a red pen and told me they constituted fraudulent misrepresentation to potential buyers and potentially to the financial institutions backing whatever Linda had planned next. He also found something in the HOA budget filings that deepened the picture considerably. Linda had approved $140,000 in community improvements over her 7 months as president, dock expansions, signage, landscaping along the community road that the dues structure could not support without significant property value increases. She had personally co-signed the HOA's infrastructure loan, putting her own assets on the line for debt that required the community to grow in ways that would require additional property. My additional property. She had committed to a financial outcome that required taking something that belonged to someone else. And she was 7 months into a plan that was now fully visible if you knew where to look. The harassment campaign that followed was a specific kind of escalation that tells you when someone has moved from opportunistic to desperate. It started with HOA notices. My cabin was cited for a weathered trim board that had been the same degree of weathered for 11 years without comment. My dock was cited for a cleat positioning that no prior HOA president had ever identified as a concern. My cedar stand was cited as a fire hazard, which would have surprised the county fire marshal who had driven past it twice a year for decades. Each notice arrived by certified mail on official HOA letterhead. Each one was professionally formatted. Each one was, in James's assessment, either inapplicable to my property given its pre-HOA status or based on interpretations of the community standards that no reasonable reading of those standards would support. We documented each one, responded formally to each one, and watched Linda's escalation strategy run directly into the wall of having a property attorney who had been doing this for 22 years and found the exercise intellectually straightforward. Then came the trespass with witnesses. Linda arrived with 2 men she introduced as environmental consultants, walked through my gate without asking, and began photographing my shoreline. She told me she was conducting a community water quality assessment authorized by the HOA board. I asked her to show me the authorization. She said it was on file. I called James from the driveway while Linda's consultants photographed my grandfather's native grass planting with the enthusiasm of people who had been told this was important, but did not fully understand why. James said 2 words: trespassing. Excellent. Deputy Henderson arrived 20 minutes later. He was professional, efficient, and clearly familiar with the HOA's recent activities in the county, given his expression when I explained the situation. He asked Linda for documentation of board authorization for the access. She said it was on file. He asked her to produce it. She said she would need to retrieve it from her office. He told her that until she could produce authorization for access to private property, she and her consultants needed to leave. He filed the report. I kept the copy. Linda left with the specific posture of someone who had just discovered that showing up with confidence is not the same as showing up with authority. The false reports were the escalation I had been expecting since James warned me the pattern would complete itself. Linda filed complaints with the State Environmental Quality Office alleging that my property's drainage management was contaminating the lake. She filed a complaint with the county health department referencing a neighbor's concern about sanitation near a shared water source. She filed a noise complaint against my dock maintenance work. Each complaint brought an inspector. Each inspector found nothing. One of them, a water quality specialist named Torres, spent 4 hours on my property and delivered a finding that my grandfather's native grass planting was actually functioning as an effective natural filtration buffer. He suggested the county use it as a demonstration site. Linda's environmental warfare had produced documentation of how well managed my property was. I kept Torres's report in the folder. The financial picture behind her desperation came through a contact in the regional real estate community who found the situation ethically troubling and said so to James. Linda had 4 pending contracts for properties she was marketing with expanded lake community access as a primary feature. The contracts were worth approximately $2.5 million combined. She had collected earnest money. She had made representations to buyers that were documented in her marketing materials and her sales contracts. She was selling access to 12 acres she did not own and could not deliver without my cooperation or my absence. James said, "Wade, this is the moment where you decide what you want out of this. You can protect your property, or you can help us protect everyone she's defrauded." I told him both sounded right to me. He said, "Then I need to make a phone call." The call went to Patricia Webb. Patricia Webb had prosecuted real estate fraud for the Attorney General's office for 14 years, before moving to the specialized unit that handled property rights violations and consumer fraud involving real estate misrepresentation. James had worked with her on 2 prior cases and described her as the kind of attorney who reads marketing documents the way other people read crime novels, with the specific attention of someone who knows how the story ends and is tracking the author's technique. She reviewed what James sent her in 3 days. She called him back. She asked if the property owner would be willing to have a conversation. I was willing. She drove to Caldwell County on a Tuesday morning in a state vehicle with a legal pad and the focused attention of someone who had seen exactly this scheme before and found the documentation we had assembled unusually complete. We sat at my kitchen table with the lake visible through the window and went through the file piece by piece. The trespass incidents, the HOA notices, the false environmental complaints, the marketing materials with my property described as community-owned, the sales contracts with access representations, the HOA budget irregularities, the 4 pending transactions. Patricia said, "This is the most thoroughly documented case of property fraud I have seen in 3 years that wasn't already in prosecution." I told her I had an irrigation background. Documentation was how you prevented expensive failures. She smiled and wrote something on her legal pad. We had been talking for approximately 90 minutes when the door opened. I want to be precise about what Linda Prescott walked into, because the details matter. She opened the door to a private residence without knocking. She was holding a stack of official-looking documents that she had apparently intended to deliver as a final legal threat. She was mid-sentence when she crossed the threshold, saying something about property access rights and the HOA's formal position, and she stopped when she registered the scene in front of her, me, at the kitchen table. A woman she did not recognize, sitting across from me with a legal pad, a state government portfolio, and the particular stillness of someone whose professional response time is very fast. Patricia looked at Linda with the calm attention of a person deciding whether this was a useful development or an inconvenient one. She settled on useful fairly quickly. She said, "Can I help you?" Linda said, "Who are you?" Patricia introduced herself. Her title, her office, the unit she worked for. She did this in the tone of someone who has introduced herself in professional contexts hundreds of times and does not attach drama to the information. Linda's hand with the documents dropped approximately 3 inches. I said, "Linda, you've entered a private residence without permission. That's the 4th documented trespass on my property in 6 months. The prior 3 are in the file on this table." Patricia said, "Ma'am, I'd recommend you consult an attorney before you say anything else in this room." Linda said 3 words. I will not repeat them here. She stepped backward out of the doorway and walked to her Range Rover and drove away at a speed that suggested she understood the situation more completely than she had 2 minutes earlier. Patricia watched through the window. Then she made a note on her legal pad and said, "That was helpful. It establishes willful entry with knowledge of prior disputes. Thank you." I poured her more coffee. The formal investigation announcement came 6 weeks later. Patricia's office issued a civil complaint against Linda Prescott personally and against the development company she operated, alleging fraudulent misrepresentation to buyers, unauthorized use of private property and marketing materials, and breach of fiduciary duty in her HOA president role related to the budget irregularities. The 4 pending real estate contracts collapsed within 10 days of the announcement. The buyer's attorneys contacted James directly in 2 cases. Linda's personal financial guarantees on the HOA infrastructure loan became immediately relevant to the lender when the fraud investigation was made public. The loan went into default review. The Texas Real Estate Commission suspended her license pending the investigation's outcome. The suspension was announced at a regional real estate association meeting that a local reporter covered. The story ran in 3 county newspapers and was picked up by the Austin Market. Linda's attorney filed a motion to dismiss the Attorney General's complaint on procedural grounds. The motion was denied within 30 days. James described the denial as unusually swift, which he said communicated something about the quality of the documentation Patricia had submitted. The criminal trespassing charges that Deputy Henderson had been building since the 2nd documented incident were filed the same week. 4 counts. The false environmental reports generated a separate referral to the state agency for potential penalties on the complainant. Linda's Range Rover was in her driveway less frequently after the suspension. I noticed this during my morning walks. A realtor's sign appeared in her yard 11 weeks after the investigation announcement. The property sold below market, which the county appraisal records confirmed, to a family from San Marcos who appeared to have no interest in HOA politics and whose children I have since watched catch their first bass off the community dock. The resolution arrived in stages the way these things do when the documentation is thorough and the agencies involved take the matter seriously. Linda accepted a negotiated resolution that covered civil restitution to the defrauded buyers, a permanent ban from HOA officer positions in the state of Texas, and a 5-year supervised restriction on her real estate license that functionally ended her career in the field. She sold the Range Rover. I know this because the new owner drives it through the county occasionally, and it is now beige instead of white, which seems right somehow. The HOA elected new leadership at an emergency meeting attended by more residents than any prior meeting in the organization's history. The new president, a retired civil engineer named Frank, came to my cabin with a formal written apology from the board and a request to sit down and establish a clear understanding of property boundaries, easement rights, and the mutual obligations that should govern how the community and my 12 acres coexisted. We sat on my porch with the lake in front of us and talked for 2 hours. Frank had a notepad. He drew diagrams. He asked precise questions and wrote down precise answers. He reminded me of James in the way that competent people remind you of other competent people. They use the same tools differently, but with the same underlying respect for accuracy. We established a written understanding. Not a legal document, though James reviewed and blessed it. A statement of mutual recognition of property lines, easement rights, and maintenance responsibilities that was signed by both of us and filed with the county records as a matter of clarity for any future parties. James said he had never seen a neighbor dispute resolve itself into something that clearly written. I told him it helped to start with an accurate map. The scholarship fund came out of a conversation Carol and I had about what to do with the speaking fees I had started receiving from property rights organizations who wanted to describe the case as a model for documentation practices. The fund supports rural students pursuing degrees in land management, agricultural law, or water resource engineering. 3 students received awards in the first year. One of them is studying real estate law with a specific focus on rural property rights, which Patricia told me when I described it to her was the most satisfying irony she had heard in a while. I still walk the property line on Sunday mornings. The cedar stand is intact. The native grass planting my grandfather put in along the shoreline is doing what he planted it to do. The water quality readings Torres documented are in the county's environmental records as a positive example. The cabin is still standing. The original framing still carries my grandfather's pencil measurements. The dock float mechanism I was working on when I overheard Linda's sales pitch works correctly and has for 2 seasons. Some mornings I sit at the kitchen table with coffee and the lake in the window and think about the specific physics of what happened, how Linda's plan required my absence or my surrender, and how neither of those was available, and how the documentation accumulated with the patience that irrigation work teaches you until the weight of it became more than any scheme could carry. Patricia called me 6 months after the resolution to tell me the case had been cited in a state bar continuing education seminar on property fraud documentation. She said they used the timeline we had built, the dates, stamped photographs, the formal responses to each HOA notice, the recorded inspector reports, the marketing materials I had preserved before Linda's website was taken down. She said, "Your file was better organized than most prosecution packages I've built from scratch." I told her I had an irrigation background. You document the inputs and the outputs, and the system either holds or it tells you where it's failing. She said that was an unusually accurate description of fraud investigation. The cabin is quiet most mornings now. The lake does what lakes do, which is mostly reflect light and make the kind of sounds that remind you why your grandfather bought 12 acres in 1951 and built a place where his family could watch thunderstorms roll in without anyone telling them what to do. No one has opened that door without knocking since Linda Prescott learned what was on the other side. Leave your story in the comments. The HOA dispute, the property line fight, the moment someone walked into a situation they had completely misread. I read every one. Subscribe, stay with it. The door is locked. It will stay that way.